and welcome to our panel to What Democracy Means in Everyday Life. Today's topic focuses on civic engagement and technology. I'm Nina Shamsi, member at large of the League of Women Voters of Massachusetts, and I'll serve as the moderator for today's conversation. This panel is co-sponsored by the League of Women Voters of Massachusetts and is co-produced by New TV. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan multi-issue grassroots organization that encourages informed, active participation of citizens. This discussion was recorded on Tuesday, July 8, 2025, at the New TV studios in Newton, Massachusetts. Now I'd like to welcome our panelists. Joining us today, Kate Crawford, the director of the Technology for Liberty program at the ACLU of Massachusetts, and a director's fellow at MIT Media Lab. Sonia Nadeem, rising high school senior and voter and founder and president of the Vote Movement, a national youth-led nonprofit dedicated to increasing voter turnout in local elections. And finally, Professor Laura Edison, assistant professor of computer science at Northeastern University and the former chief technologist of the Antitrust Division and the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. Let's begin. Welcome, panelists. Thank you for being here. So let's start with setting the stage. The bedrock of democracy is having a dialogue. The ACLU is a stalwart promoter of free speech and internet speech in particular. So, Kate, how has social media changed how people engage on civic issues, learn about candidates, and also get election information?
I think social media has changed the way that we engage with elections in a number of different ways, some positive and some not so great. One of the positives, obviously, is that candidates that don't have huge budgets or large fundraising operations have been able to take off due to their ability to attract followers on social media. You could see perhaps the Zohran Mamdani campaign in New York as an example of a campaign that's made really good use of social media as a way of speaking directly to voters. And some of the videos that they've made have gone viral many times over. And I think that's been a key part of his success in terms of his ability to communicate directly with the voting population of New York City. Also, obviously, voters themselves and citizens have been able to use social media to lift up issues that are important to them. Prior to the rise of social media, obviously, it was legacy media institutions, newspapers, television stations that were sort of setting the tone and the framework of the debate on a lot of issues. And I think for good and for ill in some ways, the rise of social media has allowed ordinary people to assert their own preferences or ideological perspectives, or to make issues that are relevant to them central to campaigns. So, that's been really important, I think. One of the downsides of social media use with respect to how it impacts our elections is the way in which campaigns have been able to micro-target individual people using advertising networks through institutions like Facebook that essentially enable campaigns to tell very different stories about candidates to different people based on what they think those people want to hear. So the Obama campaign actually did that to begin with, and then the Trump campaign in 2016, obviously, with the Cambridge Analytica project and Facebook, used those tools very effectively to speak in a sort of micro-targeted way to voters. And I think that does raise some issues for our democracy.
Yeah, that naturally leads to one of the questions that I had for Laura. So how do you think it's possible then for people to find reliable information in the context of this micro-targeting that tries to build a consensus?
It's really difficult, and it takes a lot of work on the part of normal citizens. I mean, I think listening to what Cade said about social media and the way candidates use it, one of the things that strikes me is, when you are talking about, here are the positives, here are the negatives, you're talking about the same thing. You are the way that candidates who don't have a large established base can break through is through that kind of targeted advertising. The Mamdani campaign used a ton of social media advertisements that were highly targeted. That was how they made videos go viral, is through ads. So many of the most effective candidates and campaigns that we have seen over the last few years, they have been on social media And the way that they have delivered and the way that they have taken off is through micro-targeted ads. So when you are talking about, you are not talking about two different phenomena, you are talking about two sides of the same coin. And I think what that means for, for citizens, is that what you are seeing in your feed, that is what people are paying to show you, what brands are paying to show you, and what a platform and an algorithm wants you to see. And platforms want you to be on the platform because when you're there, they're selling your attention. I don't think we have to assign any kind of nefarious intention here. It's just a very simple business motive of capturing people's attention and holding it for as long as possible. And so, what that means is that, different platforms do that in different ways. There are platforms where the way that they hold your attention for as long as possible is that they tell you a bunch of things that confirm your priors. They tell you a bunch of things that you already agree with or that are in line with other things you're hearing from other sources. They don't challenge your views. And there's other platforms that are built a little bit differently and are more about getting you to comment, getting you to interact. But I think what this means is that you cannot rely on a platform or technology to give you a broad sampling of the opinions that are out there, or a representative view of facts. That's on every citizen. That is the responsibility of every person out there to make sure that they're informed. And so what I would encourage people to do is to, really ask themselves, how often are you confronted with opinions that you don't agree with? And if you are not regularly seeing things that you think, I respect that, but I disagree with it, or maybe something a little harsher than that, you maybe need to broaden your media diet.
That's fair. I think in that terms, Sonia, your generation, it's constantly bombarded by the kind of messaging that both Kate and Laura are talking about. So I guess what kind of response do you have to that then?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think for me, something that I've noticed is that social media has made a lot of my peers more civically engaged, whether that's for the better or worse. I do think, I really agree with what you said about how we need to broaden our perspectives and what we listen to. I think for me, in terms of finding reliable civic information, what I tell my peers and what we kind of try to propagate through the vote movement is making sure that you're double checking everything that you see in social media with more primary sources. That might include checking with what your local League of Women Voters is saying, right? Because that's a nonpartisan organization that is spreading a lot of helpful and nonpartisan information about the election. Maybe that means looking at your local town clerk's office or looking at the Secretary of State's information to see if what you're hearing from these campaigns is repeated by those nonpartisan sources that don't really have a motive to make you necessarily believe something. Through kind of the town ambassador program, we do think that it's really important that they create an ecosystem of trust themselves. I think if we create a space where voters are more likely to trust specific organizations like their local town clerk's office, which they might not necessarily have the time to go and visit and talk to, having people like the town ambassadors who are raising awareness about the election that way, I think is really helpful.
That's a really fair point. Although, enter AI and deepfakes.
Yeah.
And so now there are several tools that anyone can use for both positive and negative to, at scale, do a lot of misinformation or disinformation, but information change, essentially. So, I guess I'll stick with you, Sonia. How would you want to respond to that?
Yeah. I think with AI and deepfakes, obviously there's, again, going back to local elections, I think a lot of the times when I think of deepfakes or when my peers think of deepfakes, we think of celebrities saying things that they never said. That's kind of the automatic response, but I think it's also important to see how it'll affect elections. If you're someone who's not necessarily fluent, media fluent, you might look at something and it could be an entire political campaign just formulated by AI. Everything is just fake and you don't know that. I think kind of one way to make sure that's true is, again, looking at those primary sources, like I mentioned. I think just in general, making sure that you know that it's not just celebrities or pop culture that's being affected. It's also your local elections. It's also your national elections as well.
That's fair. I mean, I guess with respect to primary sources, if someone can just go in and change information and make it pretend as though, I guess, Kate, would you have any response to, especially in terms of the kind of work that ACLU does? What do you think is their concern there?
Misinformation and disinformation is obviously a huge concern. It's influenced our politics tremendously. I mean, we can look at the conversation around vaccines as a really primary example of that. The scientific evidence is clear, and yet, there are a lot of people who are believing things about vaccines that are not based in scientific evidence because of the promotion of mis and disinformation about them that's really all over the internet. In politics, though, propaganda and lies are not new, right? I mean, it's not a feature of 21st century technology that people are trying to deceive you to get your vote or misrepresenting things for political reasons. That's been a fact of politics for as long as human beings have been engaged in politics. I think, the concern around the use of artificial intelligence to create realistic seeming fake information is obviously a new one. And to me, it highlights the importance of reliable, trustworthy journalism and media outlets. So, I would say if you see something online and you think, wow, that's crazy, or how could that be true? You should probably go to a source that you trust, a source that pays journalists, and real journalists, not, kind of people who don't actually engage in the practice of journalism, which is to go to the source, to talk to multiple sources, to do interviews with people who are involved in whatever the issue is, to get confirmation about whether or not what you're seeing online is real. I think that's more important today than ever. There are some complications from the ACLU's perspective with respect to regulating deepfakes, because those are speech, right? And we don't want to legislate in such a way that would silence people from speaking, or, for example, prohibit pranksters or The Onion or something like that from making a deepfake, mocking a political official or somebody in industry or something like that. So I think as the government looks at the state level and at the federal level to regulate deepfakes, we have to be careful not to step too far and to do something that runs afoul of our First Amendment protections. Instead, I think the ACLU's traditional response to many speech issues is you should meet bad speech with more speech, right? So if you see something online that you think, wow, that doesn't seem right, do a little bit more research and you may find out that it is in fact not true.
All right. So Laura, is that something that is in course with your perspective?
This is such a hard problem. And I think we are unfortunately in a technological space where if you see an image or a piece of text or an audio recording or a video recording and it doesn't come with provenance, if you do not know not just who is putting it in front of you, but where they got it and what the chain of custody of that content was, you have no reason to think that it has any connection to anything that ever happened in the real world. You just have absolutely no reason to think that. And while we have some tools that allow us to detect some AI-generated content, unfortunately, the reality is that so much media becomes altered in just the normal course of how we handle images and video, that isn't even the question that most people are trying to answer when they're saying, is this image real? Is this video real? The question they're trying to answer is, does this accurately reflect a thing that happened in the real world? And unfortunately, that is just not a question that we often have a technological accurate answer to. And this is why provenance is so important, and that's why all the technological solutions are going toward keeping track of the chain of custody of a piece of media so that you can track how it was altered. And what this means is we're moving to a world where something is true until it's proven fake to you should consider things fake until they're proven true. I do think, though, I absolutely respect the ACLU's position on this. I do think that we're probably moving toward a world where responsible platforms and responsible media outlets have labeling on their images that explain how they've been digitally altered, that allow users to see what the chain of custody of an image or an audio recording is. And I think when we move to a world where you can clearly see, okay, this was an Onion article, and this was clearly AI generated. This is a Reuters image, and they, tweaked the color of the background to make it more, printable. And this one is just totally fake. I think moving to that kind of world is probably the good future we're going toward, but that will probably require some amount of either industry self-regulation or maybe even some kind of government regulation. Can I raise one other point about AI, though?
Yeah.
Because I think so much of the conversation is around deepfakes and misinformation, and that is a really important conversation to have. I would say personally, I am much more worried about the impact of people who used to, when they had a question, they had a thing about the world they wanted to know, maybe they would read some news articles, maybe they would do some Google searches, and now they ask ChatGPT, or they ask Claude, or they ask DeepSeek. And the thing is that when we move to this world where we ask some other tool to curate our information environment for us and then tell us the answer, we are handing over control of how we form opinions and how we form knowledge. And, when you open up the Wall Street Journal, when you turn on MSNBC, the opinions of who is editing that content, who runs that news outlet. They broadcast their opinions, and users can make an informed choice about, do I want to go to Fox News or do I want to go to, I don't know,
Democracy Now!
Democracy Now! Right. But I think that people don't necessarily know when they go to, if they're going to go and get their news from TikTok, if they're going to go and get their news from Claude or ChatGPT, what is the editorial stance of OpenAI? And I think this is something that we don't even yet know what good transparency about something like that would be that would let users make an informed choice. But I'd say that's a big cluster of problems that I'm personally much more concerned about.
That's a really great point you raise. I guess one natural question to ask from that observation is then some sort of solution originated in open sourcing some of these models and some of the technologies related to that, so that way that you can have more eyes on the open source tools?
I would say yes. I'm very optimistic about making more aspects of models and how they're trained and their training data publicly inspectable. I slightly hesitate to use the word open source because there's a lot of playing with the definitions of what we mean by open source, but absolutely something that many of these tools are doing is they are, when they train, they are curating the information environment that they're pulling information from. And then when they serve up generative content, they are selectively pulling from that information ecosystem. And so as we are developing better tools to trace how that happens and what the process for that is, we're going to have better tools that allow models to surface, at inference time when you're using them, where did this information come from? This is something we're working on and it's not perfect yet, but those are the kinds of things that I'm really excited about, that I think there's a lot of work to be done that could be very helpful.
Could I say one thing about that?
Yeah, please.
I think that's a really important observation, and what it makes me think is that so much of the problems that we have with our technology right now are not necessarily problems that arise because of technology or can be solved by changing the technology. So, I think the correct approach to helping people understand, that when you ask ChatGPT a question, you're not necessarily going to get a fact-based answer. Even if it's 2 + 2 = what? It might get the math wrong. It also may get it wrong if you say, was the recent flood in Texas the result of climate change, right? I think what's important is that we teach young people, frankly, and honestly, older people need to learn it too, but young people are the future, media literacy, right? And teach them that LLMs, large language models, are not search engines, right? And that you shouldn't treat them like search engines, that if you want to query the internet, you should use a search engine. That Wikipedia is generally a pretty reliable source, whereas, if you ask ChatGPT something, it might not give you the right answer. I think that kind of civic education and media literacy education is really what we need to do to ensure that this new wave of technology doesn't kind of wash over people and cause more problems than it does benefit us.
So, Sonia, does the woke movement do any kind of media literacy?
Yeah, we do. So we, within our town ambassador program, which is when high schoolers are trained to raise awareness in their local elections, one of the main things that our mentors do is teach them that media literacy. And I think one of the main things that we think is really interesting in terms of media literacy is making sure that we also address the generational divide. So whenever our town ambassadors will go around and, via technology, on social media, via QR codes, all of those things, they'll use technology to raise awareness about local elections. So for young people, the odds are that if the information for the election isn't on Google or isn't on Instagram, they're just not going to bother. For people who are maybe middle age, maybe we are able to reach them at the grocery store. Maybe we're able to reach them at child care centers. And for older people, we generally will target the senior center. So there are different levels for young people, middle-aged people, older people that we use in order to get technology to them. And there are different ways, but they kind of all bridge that divide. And it kind of, instead of replacing the information with technology, instead we kind of use it to bridge all the generations together. So for example, a town ambassador will say, okay, I want to get the young people demographic, I'm going to post this on the school Instagram or do a voter registration drive. For the middle-aged people, maybe they're doing a presentation at their local Big Y. And for the older people, they're a little bit more hesitant with technology, we've seen. So they'll have a presentation at the senior center about how to access a QR code. And when you kind of address all of those different nuances, we find that the town ambassadors are more literate in terms of media, and they know how to address all of those different nuances within democracy, and then they kind of feel more cohesive and together in terms of participating in their local elections.
That's a really interesting point about having some sort of ambassador,
Yeah.
right? And in this case, it's a person.
Yeah.
But when we talk about a lot of these technological tools, especially in terms of discourse and managing conversation, we want to scale it up and then also make it efficient. Yeah. So would you ever imagine that ambassador being an AI?
Yeah, that's interesting. As of right now, I think we would use AI to supplement what the ambassador does, but I don't think I could imagine as of right now us replacing human connection. I think there's something to be said about a young person going to a senior center and having that generational divide bridged, about them saying, hey, I really care about civic engagement and you should too. I think there's something really unmatched that AI can't replace. I do think that AI could be used in the future. I know for some of our town ambassadors, they live in primarily Hispanic areas. So they've told me, they're like, hey, can I use Google Translate or ChatGPT or some sort of other tool to make the voter guide into Spanish, for example. I think supplementing it ethically might be important, but I wouldn't see them as replacing the human town ambassadors anytime soon.
All right. So in your experience then, how do the voters of different ages feel about your different use of technology in this case?
Yes, definitely. Do you mean in terms of when they are being shown the local election information?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Yeah, definitely.
Are they receptive? Or are they, saying you're doing propaganda on them?
Yeah,
So,
definitely.
What is their point of view?
So we really emphasize being nonpartisan. I think obviously there's so much political polarization happening right now at the national level, even at the state level. And so I think what we want to do is make sure that local politics are least polarized as possible. That way we can make sure that people of marginalized communities, people that we need most to be in these conversations at the federal level, if they get involved at the local level, then they're more likely to kind of step up and say, okay, I really liked politics at the local level, now I want to build up to the state level, now I want to build up to the federal level. So that's something that we kind of see with technology, again, with those kind of three main demographics. With young people, if they see a fun Instagram graphic, then they're more likely to interact with it. Obviously, that might not be the best way to be media literate, but the town ambassadors are able to really take advantage of that. Again, for people who are middle-aged, the grocery stores is one, child care centers is one. For the older people, Facebook is definitely one, Facebook community groups. So sometimes the older people, I think, will be a little bit less receptive in terms of interacting with the technology, but they're all in once you just give them maybe a few minutes explaining what it is and why it's important.
Okay, so now we've sort of talked about all people who are interested in engaging with someone, right? But what if someone's disinterested, disengaged, they don't necessarily want to do anything other than maybe just vote at the federal level? So what is something the ACLU does to address this?
Thank you for that question. We have in recent years done a few really important, one of them is ongoing, voter education and mobilization projects across Massachusetts. One, which was very successful, was the What a Difference a DA campaign, DA Makes campaign. And that was a statewide effort to educate people about the role that elected district attorneys play in their communities. We did some polling prior to launching the campaign and found, I forget what the number was, but a majority of Massachusetts voters did not know that their DAs were elected officials. We were moved to launch this campaign because for so long, district attorney races were completely non-competitive in Massachusetts, and that was really alarming to us because DAs have a tremendous amount of power. These are people who decide whether or not to prosecute someone, to potentially put them in jail and deprive them of their liberty. So that is an example of a campaign that I think was really successful, speaking exactly to the question that you're raising, which is, how do we get people to care about a local election, about a county-wide election in this case? And it was through, going out and talking to community organizations, going out and talking to churches, going and talking to synagogues and mosques and saying, look, first of all, these people are elected. Second, here are the powers that they have. They have a tremendous amount of power over your community. And you ought to get involved in the process of, picking who's gonna sit in this office, because they not only dictate prosecutions at the local level, but they also have a big voice on Beacon Hill when it comes to lobbying the legislature around issues related to the criminal legal system and surveillance and things like that. So once we, explain to people the role that DAs play and how much power they have in the community, it was really easy. People were on board right away. And in fact, right when we launched the campaign, right after that was when former DA of Suffolk County, Rachel Rollins, launched her campaign. Even the ACLU putting out there, hey, we're going to do a voter education project about the role of district attorneys, prompted someone to jump in the race, right? So, we viewed that as a success, not because we supported her. We're nonpartisan also. We don't take positions on candidates we don't endorse, but just because we were getting more people involved in the process, right? We also have a campaign that we're running right now that aims to mobilize Black and Latino voters in a number of cities across Massachusetts who historically have not shown up to vote in large numbers, particularly in municipal and state elections. So that campaign is ongoing at the moment. If you're interested in it, you can check out our website, aclum.org, and learn more about it. But that involves working with folks in community, finding out what are the issues that matter to you, right? And then connecting the dots for people about how those issues are impacted by their state and local officials, and showing them how much power they can have simply by showing up to vote in those, lower turnout elections. So that involves, training canvassers and going out and doing door knocking in the months leading up to elections. Again, not to fight for any candidate or any electoral issue, but merely to get people out to the polls who ordinarily don't participate, and to show them, the direct link between local and state elections and the issues that they're experiencing in their personal and professional lives.
Exactly. So with respect to low voter turnout, every single vote matters, and one vote can make a difference. So in those terms, with a lot of technology that comes out, we want to be able to use it with maybe better vote counting machines, maybe some kind of digital mechanism to count votes. And so Laura, maybe you can speak better to this because of your background in cybersecurity, but exactly why one should or should not do that? Maybe, to say that, why would we not want to make elections more efficient by, for example, counting digital votes, or maybe making voting electronic?
That's a great question, and unfortunately, a very complicated one. I mean, I think that, when we think about the role that technology can play in our elections, we have heard exactly why, frankly, one of the most effective ways to get humans to care about an issue is another human. It's not really a great task for an AI. So unfortunately, that's one of those areas where I just don't think technology is the best tool. And what you're bringing us back to is, what are the ways in which technology can be a bicycle, in which it is allowing humans to do more and allowing, human endeavor to go a little bit further. And I do think that there is a role for technology in helping to make sure that our voting machines are secure. And I think even more importantly, or maybe just as importantly, that people understand and trust that that their votes are secure. There are a lot of things that we can do. And I think this is actually one of the areas where the computer science community, where we haven't done enough to make the systems that we have of ensuring that, we really, really know that no one altered this vote count. We are 100% certain that no one tampered with your ballot. There are things that we just haven't done to make those guarantees, the things that we know because we have mathematical proofs behind them, to make those things accessible to the public. And I think there's a little bit that our community could be doing more to educate the public. But this place that a lot of people, I think, want to go to, where you can vote by text, or you can vote online. Unfortunately, there winds up being hard technological problems there, where it becomes difficult to both guarantee anonymity of the ballot and also to guarantee traceability of the ballot. And those two things, when you're talking about doing something over the internet, unfortunately really do come into conflict. And that's why we still show up and we either vote in person or we cast a ballot by mail. We still need that that final human step in the process in order to be able to offer those guarantees of anonymity and also traceability. But I do think that there is a lot of work to be done in continuing to make sure that, that particularly people understand how certain we are that when we do count all those ballots, that we have a count that's accurate and we have a count that doesn't leave people's votes behind and actually reflects what people did.
Yeah, for sure. So in my mind, maybe there could be an application where you vote on your phone and then you have that record forever. But why wouldn't you necessarily want to do that? I guess, what are some of the complications? You mentioned some. Sonia, what do you think?
Yeah. Honestly, I agree. I think there's a lot to say about the trust that voters would have in terms of it being online, especially for older citizens or people who are so used to everything being on paper and everything being handwritten that if you immediately shift to digital, I think it's a little bit hard for people to imagine. But one thing I wanted to go back to was the whole apathy part. I think an assumption that a lot of people have about the reason why people are disengaged is because they're too lazy to vote or they are just not willing to put in the effort. But I think a lot of it is that they feel like the system excludes them or they feel like they're just not, able to be involved. So one of the main things that we like to do is after every election, obviously we're nonpartisan, but the main voters that we want to target are the people that we want to reflect our state and federal government to be more diverse and representative of all different backgrounds. So one of the things that we do is after every election, we'll have a Google form. We'll send it to as many residents as we can that we know have interacted with it. And it kind of becomes a two-way digital feedback loop. It's okay, we're not just giving you the information, we're telling you, here's the information, but what do you think that we can improve? And they become more involved and they feel like they have more of a say in the democracy and it's more representative of them. And we think that can help. There's a lot of communities, a lot of people who don't vote in local elections. They're already struggling to make ends meet. Why would they take the time to learn about an election that they don't even think affects them? So when we're able to do that, when we're able to create that kind of feedback loop, people feel like the democracy was made for them to be involved and participate in the first place. So that's something really important, a specific aspect that we have, that kind of feedback loop that we think is really important and can be reflected in other elections as well.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, maybe what you can do is prior to an election, just measure voter turnout, and then over the course of years of your movement being involved in it, see how that increases with involvement of your movement. But yeah, that's awesome. But coming back to your point, Laura, about data privacy and protections and keeping the sanctity of the ballot intact. So why should anyone care about that necessarily? Why should people be concerned about data privacy and protections?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's something that's really easy to take for granted because it's something that for the most part we have. I think it's very easy to forget in our modern democracy why a secret ballot is so important, why it is so important that we record that you voted. It is very, very, very difficult to ascertain who someone voted. You have to stand over them and watch them fill out their mail ballot or something else. That is a cornerstone of our democracy, and places that do not have a secret ballot are not really democracies in a way that we would understand that word, what that word means. And, I think we have this broader conception of privacy that is really inseparable from our broader values of liberal democracy. We believe in the individual rights of conscience, and that leads to all of these other rights and conceptions that we have of privacy. And I think something that I think about a lot, because I do study internet and democracy globally. We have baked our values of privacy into the internet. It's not perfect. It's flawed in many ways. I think the sheer volume of surveillance advertising, as we have been talking about earlier, really demonstrates all the holes and the flaws in that. But it has still been baked into the internet on a very deep level, to the point where we can very often feel anonymous when we're online. And, we have to, and companies that want to track us and want to trace what we're doing so that they can sell us soap or whatever, they have to add all of this technology on top. And I think that's where the problem really comes up, is that companies, again, that have no nefarious intention, they want to sell you shoes or something, and they, they will trace how they're advertising to you across a range of surfaces, on your phone, on your, when you're watching Netflix, they'll trace you across all of these devices so that they can figure out, okay, she finally bought the shoes. We can, a week later, maybe we'll finally start showing her different ads. And this is where the problem comes in, because there's such a huge business of tracing people for commercial purposes, and then all of this ecosystem, the entire ad tech ecosystem gets built around that. This is why we have data brokers, and I think this is where there really does start to be there starts to become a threat to our privacy, when all of that data starts to get used for other purposes.
Right, and other purpose being maybe nation-state actors also co-opt that data for the kind of use that they want to do with targeting, with deepfakes or chatbots or any kind of other instance to create polarization. I mean, I guess it loops back to internet speech in some respect. And so what kind of, I guess, coming back to like cybersecurity in that sense, what do you think the ACLU should promote or does say about that kind of aspect?
So the ACLU very strongly supports regulation at the state level, and if we had a Congress that was interested in passing laws to benefit the public at the federal level as well, but we don't have that right now. So maybe in the future, certainly at the state level, working to pass strong digital privacy laws that curtail the amount of information that companies can collect about us, and then limit how they can use that information as well. So that's on the corporate side, and likewise, laws to limit how government agencies can collect and use information about us. So right now, we are one of our priority campaigns here in Massachusetts is a campaign to pass a piece of legislation called the Location Shield Act, and that bill is very simple. It would ban companies from selling our precise geolocation data, which is derived from our cell phones. So for many years now, there's been a market where anybody online can buy and sell and trade information showing where you go 24 hours a day, where you were 6 weeks ago, 8 months ago, 5 years ago. And as you were saying, this information is sold on the open market by data brokers. So, advertising companies make use of this information to target you with ads that can be very precise. We've seen here in Massachusetts, for example, when Maura Healey was the Attorney General, she slapped down an advertising company that was using this geolocation information to target people who were visiting abortion clinics with anti-abortion propaganda, basically messaging. So, she said you can't do that. Well, that kind of thing is happening all the time. And even worse and more frightening, the government itself is getting around the Fourth Amendment requirement that they obtain a warrant to ask your cell phone company for your historical cell phone location information, that is information showing where you were last week or whatever, or to track you in real time. Again, the government is required because of an ACLU case that we brought to the Supreme Court and one called Carpenter versus United States. The government's required to get a warrant to access that information, but they're not required to get a warrant if they can simply purchase the data from a data broker, and that is happening. ICE is buying cell phone location information and using it to track people. The FBI is doing that as well. There are some state police organizations like the Texas Department of Safety that are doing that. And so we launched this campaign in the wake of the Dobbs decision overturning Roe v. Wade, because we here in Massachusetts, the ACLU and our partners at Reproductive Equity Now and Planned Parenthood and many other organizations had worked for years to shore up our abortion rights here in the state. But what do those abortion protections really mean for folks who are coming to Massachusetts to benefit from our strong civil rights and civil liberties laws if, say the Attorney General in Texas can simply buy a list of everyone who traveled from Texas to the Planned Parenthood clinic in Brookline? Not very much, right? So we, created a coalition, and we've been fighting for a few years now to pass this legislation. There's a tremendous amount of support for it on Beacon Hill, which we're really happy about. That legislation would still allow companies like Google and Uber to collect your precise geolocation data and to use it to provide you with a service that you requested. So, if you use a mapping technology to get around, it would be no problem. If you, want Uber to tell you, to give you a good direction of where the driver's supposed to go, no issue with that. What they couldn't do is then turn around and sell that information to a third party. So that's pretty straightforward legislation that is supported by 92% of Massachusetts likely voters. We did a poll and found that left, right, center, most voters support it. So we're really hopeful that the legislature is going to move that bill this session and that it'll become law. That's the Location Shield Act. Yeah, that's right. And then we also support broader data privacy legislation that essentially uses a framework that's called data minimization. So some people might be familiar with what the Europeans have done with the General Data Protection Regulation. That was the first effort on behalf of a large government to pass digital privacy rules. That was, I guess, 10 years ago almost at this point. That is based on what's called a consent model. So that's why if you go to the Guardian newspaper, for example, or you visit a website from France or something, there will be a pop-up that says, check your privacy choices. You can select a bunch of things. We have found that doesn't really work very well for a number of reasons, and that we would prefer, and this is sort of the latest thinking in privacy, that the law limit what types of information companies are allowed to collect about you in the first place, and then also limit what they can do with that information in statute, so that the expectation of being a PhD in computer science and privacy doesn't fall on every internet user, but instead there are baseline protections that protect everyone who accesses the internet or uses a phone or something like that. So we are supporting legislation on Beacon Hill that would achieve that goal as well.
That's fair. That's awesome. So Laura, what would you like to see with your background, coming from where you are, to supplement that kind of existing legislation?
I think this is a classic kind of problem where the cost to every individual is small. That's why people generally just say yes to those consents, because it takes 2 to 3 seconds less time than navigating through all the menus to finally find, okay, how have they made it hard to say no on this website, right? And so many people say yes. And, but that doesn't mean that the collective harm of all of that isn't still adds up to something that's pretty big. I mean, we literally, all of us pay the cost of identity theft, every year, in terms of higher rates for many financial and banking services that all of which come from identity theft. In terms of laws and regulations that could do something to help, I think the data minimization framework is a really, really good one. Companies collect so much more data than they need for the interaction that they're about to have with you, than they need for their businesses. And they do it because many businesses have an explicit model of, I'm going to be reselling all of this customer data. And I think the thing that I just still struggle with is that, gosh, are we on year 13 of fighting for a federal privacy law and not getting it? And so, I think I am so glad that states are starting to take action. I think some of the bills being proposed in Massachusetts are really strong. But to your point, I just don't think it's right to leave behind people in states that aren't big enough or don't have the resources to create and enforce a strong privacy law. And we've seen from the example in Europe, GDPR is far from perfect, but companies are finding a way to do business in Europe, and we see a difference in terms of what gets collected and for users in the United States and users in Europe. We see a difference after some of the California privacy laws. These laws do actually matter, but frankly, I just think that they are things that across the United States, all Americans deserve.
Good. So,
just to be clear, we agree with that. We would support a strong federal privacy bill. Unfortunately, Congress is what it is, right? So,
and to be very clear,
yeah,
I and a lot of other people think that at this point, the way we are going to get a strong federal privacy law are strong state laws. I mean, I think this is one of those situations where the states are going to have to be the laboratory of democracy. And if that's how we get there, then that's how we get there. And that is very good in my book.
Yeah, and if I could just add quickly, the industry understands that very well. And so they have been traveling around the country trying to pass very weak privacy bills that do virtually nothing for consumers, so that when there's another serious Congress that wants to actually solve problems instead of create them for people in this country, that weak bill, that weak model will be the standard that the tech industry can point to say, look, 40 states have passed this bill that we just so happen to love. You should also pass that as the federal privacy standard. So it's actually really crucially important for that future federal debate that states like Massachusetts lead the way and pass very strong privacy laws.
And can I make one more point?
yeah, sure thing.
This stuff does not have to be hard. It does not have to be obtuse. It is made that way to make it hard for consumers to use privacy-enhancing technologies, to actually have technology that meets their desires. Why on earth can you not just set something in your browser that says, this is how I'd like to control cookies, and have every single website you visit just take those settings? There's no technological reason why that can't happen at all. There's no legal reason why that can't happen at all. There is a business reason why companies have not been incentivized to build that, why Google has not been incentivized to build that into Chrome. And I bring this up because I think a lot of times problems get blamed on technology, on, the computers are they're just too hard to use. And the actual reason why things are hard is because someone had an incentive to make them hard.
Yeah, and so with that in mind, with the need for these strong privacy bills in mind, how would a state like Massachusetts respond when there's, for example, an AI moratorium, like the federal government was trying to pass?
Well, thankfully, there isn't one. We defeated it. That was a rare victory in that horrible monstrosity that passed Congress last week. But it would be a huge challenge. I mean, people like Mark Andreessen, who's a billionaire, VC guy in Silicon Valley, supported Donald Trump in part because they were very worried that, states were going to start to regulate AI, that the federal government, if Kamala Harris had won, might try to regulate some of these companies. And they firmly believe that regulation is, essentially communism. Basically, they think any kind of rule that applies to their companies or that restricts them from, sucking every possible dollar out of this market is, anathema to democracy, when they couldn't be more wrong. So it's a huge victory that we managed to stop the AI moratorium in that legislation last week because, as you've said, the states are the laboratories for democracy in the United States. And we don't necessarily love all the AI laws that states have passed, but it's really important that states retain the ability to protect their own residents from the use of artificial intelligence technologies that banks are using, that lenders are using, that your landlord might be using, to secretly conspire with other landlords and jack up the rent in a city. It's crucial that states and even municipalities potentially retain the ability to regulate this emerging industry to protect people's basic civil rights.
But, okay, so going back to our earlier conversation where we were talking about micro-targeting with ads, would so much of these private data protection and privacy laws, would they take away from the good action of such micro-targeting? Because, Sanya, for example, in your, with the vote movement, that's something that you guys have been making use of as well, I think.
Yeah. No, definitely. We do use advertising in the sense that, we don't use paid advertising. It's just not something that's within our infrastructure right now. But I think in terms of AI, obviously, we don't use it as much. I don't think we've ever really used it in terms of, maybe translational tools or something like that. For me, when I think about the implications in terms of democracy, I think more about housing and hiring policies. That's kind of what I've been thinking about right now. Obviously, if we have so many amazing civil rights acts that have passed to prevent discrimination in housing, in hiring policies in general, that if we have something unregulated AI, like you mentioned, with OpenAI, we don't know what their stances are on certain things. So maybe the AI algorithm has some undetected biases, which have been uncovered recently, that is the reason why somebody might not have gotten a job based on their merit or something like that. So in terms of our work with local elections, I think in the local housing policies, the local hiring policies is kind of where we are most cautious about AI. But other than that, I would just use it in terms of maybe translational tools, but that would definitely need to be regulated and approved by humans as well.
All right, that makes sense. So we're 5 minutes to close. I guess my question is, what is something that you want the audience to leave with? Kate, we'll start with you.
Yeah, that's a great question. First, I just want to thank the League of Women Voters. This is awesome. And, the work that you all do to educate voters and inspire civic action in Massachusetts and across the country is really important. We've worked with you guys on many issues, and you're a great partner, so thank you. I would just say that, sort of similar to what you were saying earlier, all of these issues that we're talking about with respect to technology, whether it's, the power of big tech or, being tracked on the internet or feeling like you have no control over, the types of information that you're seeing online, many of those issues are political problems. They're not really technological problems, right? So I would say that if you're concerned about your privacy, the answer, yeah, you should download Signal on your phone and use that to communicate securely with your friends and family. No question. There are certain things that you can do as an individual to try to protect yourself and shore up your digital privacy. But what you really need to do is to get involved politically, to demand that our elected officials pass laws to protect everyone, right? As you were saying, this is, there's no technological challenge here around privacy that can't be solved through people power, through, asking our legislators to ignore, frankly, the protests that they hear from folks in the tech industry that are lobbying against these privacy bills and say, you know what? We're going to choose people over profits this time, and we're going to decide that, in fact, we would rather create a democracy and sustain a democracy in which people have that basic right to autonomy and privacy on the internet than, ignore this problem and let it get worse so that a handful of extremely wealthy people can just keep amassing piles of money that they'll never be able to spend, right? So that's what I would say, is that all of these issues are really fundamentally political problems, and if you care about these issues, you should get involved at the state and local level.
So Laura, you?
I think just to follow on that very briefly would be to say that the eternal story of technology is, someone discovers something or they create something and it is amazing and it lets us do new things, and it's also terrible and it hurts people. And slowly we as a society figure out how to keep as much of the good as we can while reducing the harms and limiting who gets hurt by some new technology. And we are in this phase where we are getting a lot of the good and we are getting a lot of the bad, and we haven't yet figured out that balance. But doing that is a collective process. And, in a democracy, we do that, like Cade said, we do that through people power by, people like me, scientists, trying to go out and get some facts, learn new things, and then bringing that into a public forum like this one, where we can, where we can talk about issues, where people can think about them. And I think that's why it is so important. All the work that the League of Women Voters does, here locally, here in the state, to help people be engaged citizens, because that is the only way that we are going to make it through some of these very difficult issues.
So it seems like what Sonia is doing is right on the money.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I think overall what I've also taken away is I think there's an assumption that to get involved with these issues that are obviously very pervasive to society is that someone who is really involved in technology, who has had a lot of experience, who is someone who has had a lot of job experience or work experience or educational experience, is the only person who can make a difference. But I think people of all walks of life have an opportunity to make a difference. If you're a high schooler, you can be a town ambassador. If you are someone who can just vote in your local elections, if you're in your local government, you can just knock on your local rep's door and ask them, hey, what are you doing to support this policy? So I think there's a lot to be said about the power that we have as people to get involved in our democracy, and that doesn't just apply to technological policies, it applies on all levels of government. But yeah, that's what I think. I think that we all, even if it does seem bleak or if it does seem hopeless, you do have the opportunity to get involved at the different levels of government and really do try to make a difference.
That's awesome. Yeah, you're here. So in conclusion, thank you for watching our panel, What Democracy Means in Everyday Life. Today's conversation is a co-production of New TV and the League of Women Voters of Massachusetts. Any use or reuse of this program requires the approval of New TV and the League and must be shown in entirety without any editing, only after the program initially airs on New TV. The opinion and statements of our panel guests are their own and not to be in any way representative of the League of Women Voters or New TV. New TV is Newton's award-winning, state-of-the-art media center specializing in television production, training, and building community of partnerships. Remember, democracy is not a spectator sport. And thank you all for being here.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for arranging this and having us.